Today's event is held in coordination with the Jewish Book Council, the only organization in the organized American Jewish community whose sole purpose is the promotion of Jewish books. In today's program, we will meet Neal Bascomb, the author of Faster, How a Jewish Driver, an American Heiress, and a Legendary Car Beat Hitler's Best. We want to say a special thank you to Igor Wasserfire with Stokes Law Group for sponsoring this event. I'm Mark Robbins, and I will be your moderator for tonight's conversation. Before we begin, there's a few programming notes. Tonight's event is brought to you in a webinar format, so you will be muted throughout the program and you will not be able to see the other attendees. If you have a question, please type it into the Q&A, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. We will try to address as many questions as possible with time permitting. Now I'd like to introduce you to our guest. Neal Bascomb is the author of 10 award-winning national and international best-selling adult books, including most recently Faster, a tale of the greatest upset in motorsports history. Before that, he wrote the New York Times bestseller on the sabotage of the German atomic bomb program called The Winter Fortress. He also chronicled the search for a Nazi war criminal in Hunting Eichmann and the story of Roger Bannister's 4-minute mile in The Perfect Mile. His work has won awards, been optioned for film and featured in documentaries, has ranked on numerous Best Book of the Year lists, and has been translated in over a dozen languages. He is also a critically acclaimed young adult writer. His book, Nazi Hunters, published by Scholastic in 2013, won the YALSA Nonfiction Award for Young Adults, as well as a number of other national and state level awards. Also from Scholastic, Sabotage and The Grand Escape were breakout hits. A former international journalist and book editor, he has also written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Los Angeles Times. He lives in Philadelphia with his family, and now please with me welcome Neal Bascomb. Neal, in honor of you, since this is a Zoom webinar, but because it's faster, we're going to call this one Zoom, Zoom, Zoom tonight.
I think that's very apt. Thank you very much for that gracious introduction. And I'm going to share my screen here so you guys can see some photographs as Mark and I talk through this. Well, thank you everyone for coming this evening and tuning in via Zoom. I'm glad to be here. As Mark introduced, I've written a range of different books, everything from Skyscraper Wars in New York in the 20s to Bannister's epic 4-minute mile, to the story of the hunt for Adolf Eichmann. And presently, actually, I'm writing about Gandhi's Salt March in India, his first major nonviolent peace movement in India in 1930. So I have this wide range, and people often ask me, how do I choose my subjects? How do I decide if I'm going to write a book? And I basically have two questions that I ask myself. The first is, do I have something new to say? And in this story of Faster and Renee Dreyfuss and Lucy Schell, who supported him and took on the German silver as the best Grand Prix motorsport team in history at one point, there really hadn't been much written about Renee and Lucy and this David and Goliath tale. So the ground for me to furrow and to uncover was almost complete. There really was no competing titles. I could write this story in a way that no one's written about it because it hadn't really been discovered before. So I traveled all over Germany and throughout France and Italy, and a bunch of archives and collections here in the States to put together this story of Renee Dreyfuss, the driver, and Lucy and the Delahaye car company that helped build the Grand Prix car that raced. Now, the second question I ask myself is, does this story have something important to say? And I'll be honest and tell you that I never thought that I'd actually write a motorsport book. I'm not a huge Indy fan or Grand Prix fan, or wasn't before venturing on to this story. But I really, what I loved about this story in particular was, one, to begin with the time period. I think that interwar period in Europe in the 1930s as one person described it, was sort of like walking on quicksand. You didn't quite know where your footing was. And so it was really a very revealing time in Europe and in the course of history overall. Really, what I thought was important about this book, important to say in this story, is it's really a story about resistance. That Renee and Lucy standing up against the Nazis, sort of piercing their seeming invincibility. Did it stop the Nazis? No, but they served as really a symbol. And as some people called Renee Dreyfuss for defeating the best of the Germans, he was kind of a divine avenger for a lot of people in this period where the Germans were sort of trouncing everyone in the Grand Prix and in many other fields as well. So it's really a story about that resistance, about what people were doing in this period of time and how they fought back. I first came to this story actually through a friend of mine in New York. I was visiting him, and he told me this. He had been pitched this story for an article about this remarkable car called the Delahaye 145. And it had this intriguing backstory where when the Germans invaded France and they descended into Paris, this car, or the 4 Delahaye 145 Grand Prix cars that were overbuilt, were taken away from the city, hidden in caves. 2 were disassembled and hidden in shops in Paris. So that the Nazis couldn't find them. Renee Dreyfuss was secured out of the country so he wouldn't be found. And even the Germans sent Gestapo officers to the Automobile Club of France, where they actually ended up seizing all the records, the race records from that time period, had them hauled away, and they'd never been seen again. And this story about trying to erase history, I really was just fascinated by what was it about this car. What was it about Renee Dreyfuss? What was it about his supporter, Lucy Schell, that made the Germans so intent on destroying any record of their presence or their victory during this period? And so that sort of set me on to this trail of this story. And then now I'd love to just open it up for Mark and I to have a conversation about the book and anything else that we sort of venture into. So I'll welcome Mark back.
When I was reading the book, I had to check the cover a few times because I didn't know if I was reading Robert Ludlum or Don Winslow, or it was intense and exciting, and it was hard to believe that it was nonfiction. So you have 3 figures. You've got Lucy O'Reilly Schell, who's the heiress. You've got Charles Zweifenbach, who's the director of Delahaye, and you've got a French-born Jewish race car driver. How did the 3 of them get together?
Sure. So I'll start with Renee. Renee, I'll start with sort of the middle of their story, and over the course of the conversation, I imagine we can sort of venture into their sort of more of their backstory. But Renee, in 1936, when these 3 people came together, Renee formerly was one of the top Grand Prix drivers in Europe at the time. He was born in Nice. His father was Jewish. His mother was Catholic, originally from Italy. And by 1936, because of the rise of anti-Semitism throughout Italy, throughout Germany, and throughout most of Europe, actually, at this point in time, Renee found himself suddenly removed from the Alfa Romeo race team, and he couldn't get a job driving for anybody else, really. So he found himself banned from the best teams and the best cars. And so by 1936, he's kind of like like a jockey without a horse. The second individual, and I'll show you a shot of Renee, that's Renee as I talk about him. The second person is Lucy Schell. So Lucy Schell was an American heiress. Her father passed away in 1934, 35, and gave all his wealth to her. Hold on, I'm going to get back to sharing my screen here so I can, so you all can see these pictures. Good. Do you see that now?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So Lucy Schell, American heiress, given all her family money by 1935. Prior to that, she was one of the early speed queens. She was an incredibly good rally driver. And her husband was her partner. She was the one of the top-ranked American rally drivers in the world. By 1935, 1936, where they get together, Lucy had decided that her racing days were over, but she didn't want to leave the sport. And so she had long held a sort of negative feeling, would be the soft way of saying it, towards the Germans. Because she was a nurse during World War I. She saw the sort of devastation in Paris, the soldiers returning from the front. And she saw in 1935, 1936, the Germans just trouncing, as I mentioned, everyone else in racing because of the investment by Hitler in the silver race cars. And no one was really standing up to them. And so she ventures off to start her own Grand Prix race team, which is pretty remarkable, right? One, to just start your own Grand Prix race team, period. Two, for a woman at this period of time to do that was remarkable. And in fact, she was the first woman to ever start and fund and lead her own Grand Prix race team. And I'm hard to say who else has done that since. So she decides to do this. And so that's how she gets into this. She decides that she needs a driver, so she taps Renee Dreyfuss, who's not racing for anybody else. The last individual, Charles Zweifenbach, who I will show you here, is on the far left, or my left, wearing the hat. Charles was the head of the Delahaye company. In the early 1930s, that car company had kind of found its way closing in on bankruptcy. They had largely become a trucking company, building everything from trucks to mail trucks to fire engines, but really cars were not their specialty. As one person said, the Delahaye car was probably best driven in a funeral procession. It was slow, it was clunky, it wasn't terribly good to look at, but it would keep running and running and running. And so in order to revive their fortunes, the Delahaye company decides to venture forth and go into racing. And the individual you see on the far right with the mustache and the sort of dapper hair, Jean-Francois, was their young engineer. He was a brilliant guy, and designs first what's called the Delahaye 135, which was more of a sports car for longer races, and then he develops the Delahaye 145 because Lucy Schell storms into his office one day in 1936 and says, "Listen, Monsieur Charles, as she called him, you're going to build me a race car. I'll fund it from top to bottom, and we're going to beat the Germans." And so that's how these three individuals come together in this remarkable period of time. And it's, a good part of the story I tell in Pastor.
How was Dreyfuss received by the non-Jewish drivers?
Well, that's an evolving question, right? So in the early 1930s, the racing community was largely one, and you see this over the course of time in the history of motor racing. Like, there are times when the racing is about the particular car companies who are building these cars, and then it's about the countries that are helping fund them and they're representing. So in the early 1930s, the Grand Prix racing is really about the car companies. It's about Alfa Romeo, it's about Bugatti, it's about Maserati, it's about Mercedes-Benz, and who's building the best car, and then the driver, whether you're French, Italian, German, British, whatever, you will gravitate yourself towards the best cars. And it doesn't really matter what country they're representing. And so these top Grand Prix drivers, and let's say there's 15 of them, and Renee was definitely one of those 15, they're really close, right? They switch teams together often, they travel together, they race each other every weekend, and although they're literally almost killing each other on the track, they go out for drinks afterwards, their wives or their lovers or friends, and it's kind of a community. And so you find that Renee Dreyfuss was very friendly with, let's say, another key character in this story, Rudy Caracciola, who was a top German driver. They were friends. Their wives were friends. They vacationed together. and then things change, of course, as Europe changes in the 30s. So Mussolini, and then of course Hitler comes to power, and that rise of nationalism takes over Europe, and that changes racing again. And so racing becomes a very nationalistic affair. It becomes the Germans against the French against the Italians, and everyone's trying to beat each other. And so layered into that, of course, is this rise in anti-Semitism, which I mentioned. And so you have Renee and others seeing those friendships fray and divide. And so what once was a great coming together on weekends where there are races, everyone is compartmentalized at the hotels, they're not speaking, and it's a really divided world. And so Renee's Jewish heritage really didn't matter until Europe sort of transitioned, and then it became something that was in the forefront, and ultimately, as I had mentioned, got him banned or removed from the teams that he was on.
Do you think his being Jewish had anything to do with him wanting to beat Hitler at the Olympics? He seemed to be more secular than religious.
Yeah, Mark, you're right. Like Renee said, racing is my religion, right? He was raised. His parents gave him a choice. You could be Jewish, you could be Catholic. We'll raise you as both, and you could choose. He chose cars, right? And he chose driving through the hills of Nice as fast as you can, and then going into to racing in the Grand Prix. Religion, but the fact is, his last name was Dreyfuss, right? And so in Europe at that time, Dreyfuss was probably the most recognizable Jewish name, of course, because of the trial of Colonel Dreyfuss and the whole affair with that. And so Renee's Jewish heritage was kind of forced onto him, and he was assigned to be Jewish by the general public, by racing teams. And in fact, he was very good, and the Germans wanted to hire him. The head of the German race team, Alfred Neubauer, wanted to bring him on board and wanted to have him drive for their team, but it was very clear that he couldn't because he was Jewish. And Neubauer famously makes this statement that Hitler will decide who's Jewish, but with a name like Dreyfuss, of course, there was just no way that he was going to compete for the Silver Arrows. I think what's interesting in this story, in particular in the relationship with Lucy Schell and Renee, is that Lucy is the one who really, I guess the best way of saying it is gets Renee to understand that he could be a symbol, that he could, even though he didn't consider himself Jewish, he could be a representative for the oppression, for all the terrible things that were happening, and he could fight back. And so that fight back became part of it. That Jewish characteristic nature of him became part of the story and part of the reason he wanted to beat the Germans so badly. So I would definitely say by the end of the story, he is driving as a Jew trying to beat the Nazis. At the start of the story, he's just a race car driver trying to win, trying to be the best, trying to, he loved the fame, he liked the money, he liked the women, but that changes over the course of the story.
So it's 1936, and we're at the Olympics, and Jesse Owens turns everything upside down by winning. And you've got the American men's rowing team who turns everything upside down by winning. And now you've got Renee Dreyfuss, who is like a Jesse Owens in a car. Where does he fall in the not in the
well, I wrote a book about him, so I think he's the best. I think he's the top. But no, I think these are definitely parallel stories. And I remember when I was first sort of venturing into writing this book and going around and talking to my publisher and editors about it, it was kind of pitched in a way like this is the Jesse Owens story of motor racing, which sort of like instantly people sort of got it, of course. Yes, this is a story like the 1936 Olympics, a story about nationalism and a story about defeating Hitler and all that. I think what separates this story those and gives it a sort of added layer, added heft, is the fact that, the Germans dominating motorsport, which was definitely something that Hitler set out to do in 1933. He gave a speech at the Berlin Motor Show, second speech he ever gave as the new Chancellor of Germany. And he talked about, one, the Autobahn, two, raising, revitalizing the German automobile industry, aligning it with aviation, and then fourth, dominating motorsport. And that was going to be a publicity bonanza for the Germans because, of course, Grand Prix racing was the top sport in Europe at this time. So winning, just like the Olympics, was, this intersection of sport and nationalism. But it had this other layer, and that was the Germans had developed through this individual named Adolf Hundlein, this paramilitary organization, much like the SS, called the NSKK. And the NSKK was a paramilitary organization whose sole purpose was to recruit and train young men to drive, take care of cars, take care of trucks, and to sort of go into what's called this motor corps. And through dominating the Grand Prix, through these silver arrows, through all the millions and millions of marks invested in these cars, and the propaganda behind that, and I'll just show you a poster here. This is just one of hundreds of propaganda posters. This is Rudy Caracciola driving the Mercedes-Benz champion, and everyone giving him the Sieg Heil. This helped promote the NSKK, helped recruit hundreds of thousands of young men to this paramilitary organization. When all aligned towards the point of course, war. And so these individuals in the NSKK, who Rudy Caracciola and Mercedes and Auto Union helped recruit, served as the foundation for the motorized infantry, the Blitzkrieg operations that ultimately allowed the Nazis to dominate in warfare so early. And the second thing that extra layer is all the money that I mentioned put into these silver arrows cars to make them the fastest, most technologically advanced race cars ever seen on the tracks in the cities of Europe. All that technology, all that supercharged engines, the aerodynamics of those cars, everything was all shared, coordinated with aero engines. So the Luftwaffe, much of the technology used in this development for these cars then became, again, an instrument of war. And so this is not just a story about sport. It's a story, in essence, about war and how those silver arrows helped foster that.
And how did Hitler try to change history after the Olympics? He didn't have a good run. It was not a good week.
No, I mean, so the big race between the Silver Arrows and Lucy Schell and Renee comes in 1938 at the start of the Grand Prix season, which is a new season in the Grand Prix, a new formula, so new cars, new engines, new regulations, and so that first race is really the proving grounds for who's going to dominate and who's going to win and who's sort of brought the best. And Delahaye and Renee and Lucy sort of wiped the field remarkably. This small David-like team that only a handful of people worked for them against hundreds of engineers and mechanics and dozens of cars and drivers that Mercedes brought, and Auto Union, the other German team, brought to the fray. That became a huge, the Po opening 1938, which was sort of my Olympics of this story, was a huge embarrassment to the Germans. It came on the exact day of the vote for the Anschluss of Austria. Hitler was embarrassed. The whole German team was embarrassed. Rudy Caracciola, the driver, dropped out because he was being beat so bad. Then another driver had to jump into the car seat to try to take on Renee, and it became something. They tried to erase it from all the newspapers, and then when war broke out, they wanted to erase it from history, and they, like many things, failed.
What happened to the cars that were still in existence then?
So the cars themselves, Lucy owned. There were 4 of these Grand Prix cars, and here's a picture of one of them. Renee called it the ugliest looking car he'd ever seen. Compared that to these sleek Silver Arrows, but they were very nimble, powerful cars. There were only 4 ever built, and 2 of them were, all 4 were driven to Paris. 2 of them were disassembled, as I mentioned earlier, and hidden in sort of plain sight in auto body shops in central Paris. 2 others were hidden away outside the city in caves. All 4 sort of made it through the war, and of course, after the war, people weren't really terribly worried about cars or the Grand Prix, and so they found themselves dismantled and transformed into sports cars and all kinds of other things. But they've since, over the course of time, been restored to their former glory. I've driven in one of them in California. It is an absolutely horrifying, exhilarating, horrifying experience to be, it's like riding in a sled, open air with no harness. And it sounds like a boat engine. Your whole seat shakes. And I think we went something like 90 miles an hour through these orange groves in California. And these cars would race, and I felt like I was flying at that point, flying, into a ditch. But these cars were going 130, 140 miles an hour in races. So they were pretty powerful. And they've been restored by 2 American collectors, Peter Mullen, who owns 3 of them, and then a collector on the East Coast who owns 1 of them.
So these are 2-seaters. Did you get to drive it in California?
These cars are worth, I got to sit in the driver's seat, but I actually drove as a passenger because I was alerted to the fact that the car was worth many millions of dollars. And I was not properly trained to drive it. I mean, it's remarkable. I mean, the narrowness of the wheels, the shifting was challenging, and so no, I did not end up driving it.
How was the experience, though?
I can still remember every moment of it. I mean, it really does. Your whole body shakes in it, and the reverberation from the engine. You have to sort of fold yourself into the seat because it's pretty hard to actually get in there, and you are sort of reclined back in it. But it was pretty remarkable, and we were driving through traffic, and the person driving was just, step on it, and just that 12-cylinder engine would just boom.
Yeah. Are there any family members left that you know of or spoke to?
So Renee actually didn't have any children, but he had a brother and sister. They had children. I spent time with Renee's niece in France. She was very generous with me in giving me all kinds of photographs. Here's a photograph of one of the photographs she gave me of Renee after winning Pau in 1938. So she was, even when I first started this story, and I mentioned in the first part of this conversation about how, no one had really written about this before. And, that's both a benefit and a challenge, right? Because there's not a whole lot of sources that you can just immediately say, okay, well, I'm going to go here and find something. And I almost gave up writing about this. And then Renee's niece, after many letters and back and forth, reached out to me and said, we do have some things, and let's have a conversation. She ended up sending me this huge stack of papers, clips, scrapbook, I guess would be the best way of describing it, news articles in dozens of languages, letters, photographs, everything down to, the speeches at Renee's funeral, which really gave me a real window into who he was and kind of individual he was. And then Lucy Schell, similarly, very, very tough nut to crack. Her two children died a number of years ago. One of them became a Indy race car driver. And so her family history I ended up finding in this small village in France. And also the Peter Molyn Museum had a bunch of stuff, photographs, papers, letters that she would write the editors of these French newspapers because they would not give her credit for running the Grand Prix team. She was, probably my favorite individual to write about in this story. She just was an absolute firecracker. This is a shot of her and her husband, Laurie, who sort of brought her into the sport. This is them at the end of the 1936 Monte Carlo rally, which they were one of the best at.
How is he? Is he taught or received in France today? Do people know who he is or who he was?
What's so interesting about this story is that people, these people have largely disappeared from history, right? So if I was to ask, a dozen people who consider themselves, well steeped in motorsport history, I would say, maybe one of them, and this is not a scientific poll, would know or ever even heard of the name Lucy Schell, let alone Laurie Schell. She passed away right after the war, and the fact that she was the first woman to run and start her own Grand Prix race team, the fact that she was, the top American Monte Carlo rally driver, one of the first speed queens, like she just disappeared from history. And so, one of the joys of writing this book was finding her story, exploring it, and telling it to as many readers as possible.
What happened to the sales or how were the sales of Mercedes affected after the war with its association with the Nazis?
It didn't. The repercussions were not what you would imagine them to be, right? So both Mercedes and Auto Union, which was the predecessor of Audi, they of course stopped racing during the war, but after the war, they sort of got right back into it. They dominated. Mercedes-Benz dominated racing in the 50s. Rudy Caracciola, the sort of top champion, was a salesperson for Mercedes after the war. Alfred Neubauer, who ran the team pre-war, also ran the team in the 1950s. They sort of, although they were, the history of what they did and their participation and their support of the Nazi government was sort of obscured for a long time, and I find it an absolute shame.
Did you find any in your research, anyone who did not want to talk to you?
I think originally Mercedes was a little reluctant to, I felt they were reluctant to share information like Alfred Neubauer's notebooks. Alfred was notorious for keeping these, he always had a notebook with him, writing down, what's happening and everything. And I know that Mercedes had acquired those notebooks at a certain period of time. They would not show me those notebooks at all. That said, they ended up being extremely generous with me in terms of opening up their archives as well as their photographs. And so I got to see inside their files from the pre-war racing, and they were voluminous. I mean, they kept everything. There were reports of, they would call Germany mid-race and report on what was happening, who's winning, why, who's leading, who's falling out. They had pre-race trials. the design of the engines, the status of the drivers. I mean, literally, reporters or historians dream of finding out exactly what happened in what sequence and what was going on, and all that was there, including their support from getting money from the Nazi Party to develop these cars, how much money, how important it was to propagate this sort of Nazi propaganda, how involved they were with that. All that was in the archives, and I credit Mercedes for opening that to me.
Has the book been published in France yet? And if so, how was it received?
I hate to say it has not been published in France. I can't believe it. But for some reason, it hasn't found a publisher in France. It found a publisher in England and a number of places, but not in France. I'm still keeping my fingers crossed. So if anyone's on this line who's a French publisher, you never know. Please reach out to me.
You drove in the car a racer from then, from 1936. How do you think they would look at racing today on the Grand Prix circuit and the technology that's happened from then to now?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say this about it. The level of safety, although of course driving Grand Prix cars is still a very dangerous business, right? And bad things happen every year, but just it was so dramatically different in the 1930s. It was probably one of the most dangerous points in time of motor racing, because the cars went from the level, the technology acceleration and the speed acceleration of these cars from the early 1930s to by the end of the 1930s, largely thanks to German technology. Like they were going from, averaging, let's say 100 miles an hour to, going up to 180. Some of these cars breaking speed records of 250 miles per hour. Okay, so you have this just massive advance in speed. No safety precautions whatsoever. No roll bars, of course. The helmets, if they wore them, were cloth. No safety harnesses. Maybe they have a belt. The cars were much more difficult to handle. And so you would find that these, almost on every weekend, when there was a race, there was someone being injured, someone dying. As Renee said, I'm quoting him, I was intimately acquainted with death. He had one race where 4 of his close friends were killed in a single race at the 1934 Italian Grand Prix. It just was a viciously dangerous business. And so I would say that would be the biggest separation between them. I think race car drivers are race car drivers, right? I mean, everything that I read about Renee and Rudy and Tazio Nuvolari, the Italian champion, and then reading about present day race car drivers. That same intensity, that same fascination with speed, that same sort of love for the myopic view of the world that they get while racing, where everything else disappears, and they're seeing everything around them, but nothing else, and loving that sort of simpleness in a way. Mm-hmm. Renee talks about that. Rudy talks about it. Modern day drivers talk about that as well.
So other than Renee, who else put an extra tank of gas on the seat next to him too? There wouldn't be a pit
yeah, I mean, this is that. So what you're referring to is the 1930 Monaco Grand Prix. This is a shot of post race. That was really the race that Renee sort of catapulted into the top ranks of the Grand Prix, and he did it rather sneakily by putting in a spare gas tank on his passenger seat, so he didn't have to pit stop. And so Louis Chiron, who was the French well, he was actually Monegasque, but considered the French champion, was beaten by Renee that day because of that. So, and similarly to 1938, one of the things about the Delahaye race car, these Silver Arrows that the Germans were driving, supercharged engines, their gasoline was more like rocket fuel, and they just burned through it like crazy and would have to stop. The Delahaye car engine that Renee ended up racing was called the son of a truck because it had a kind of truck engine, and it would just go and go and go without consuming a lot of gasoline in normal gasoline. So it was one of several reasons why Delahaye, Renee, and Lucy ended up beating the Silver Arrows.
Mm-hmm. Did Renee continue racing after the Olympics, and how old was he when he passed away?
So, Renee had this, Renee finished racing in 1939, right before the war broke out. Lucy got him out of the country he was already part of the, he was a volunteer in the French army. But Lucy thought that was too dangerous given what, his victories against the Germans. So she petitioned the French government, although she was American, to send Renee to participate in the 1940 Indianapolis 500. And so Renee was on a boat to the States when Germany invaded France. So he couldn't come back. He ended up staying in the United States, joining the U.S. Army, ended up participating in the landing of Allied forces in Italy, fought his way north through to the end of the war, and then found his brother and sister in Nice who had fought in the resistance. I mean, there's an incredible story. You can write a whole book about it. And then he moved to the United States with his family, ended up starting this probably the most noted French restaurant in New York at the time, La Chanticleer, which became this sort of nexus point for racing and French cuisine. And he was the maitre d' and the owner of this restaurant for several decades, and passed away in New York about, I don't know how many years now, over 20 years ago.
Did people know who he was as the maitre d' of the hotel, of the restaurant?
Absolutely. I mean, Renee was famous, right? I mean, he was, as one person called, he was the Babe Ruth of France at a certain point. I mean, his victory against the Germans was the biggest news. It was in every, front page of every newspaper. And so he was a very famous guy, for sure. And if you were in New York passing through, and you were a top race car driver, you would come in and you'd pay homage to Renee at La Chanticleer, and he had quite a life.
Mm-hmm. Was there ever any kind of reconciliation between Renee and the German drivers who he was friendly with before the Olympics?
There's some touching. I don't know. I never kind of got this absolute clarity on how, like, for instance, Rudy Caracciolo, who's really, if you were to say who's the antagonist in this story, although he's it's not black and white, it's pretty gray. Mm-hmm. But they were friends, of course, before the nationalism in sport. They became sort of heated enemies. Ultimately, Rudy, after the war, later in life, he visited Renee. There's shots of them in La Chanticleer on a visit. They look friendly, but I imagine there was always that undercurrent of the past and what happened. But Renee did not like to speak about that particular period in time and what happened, and so I imagine he kept it pretty quiet.
Did he and Lucy stay in touch?
Yeah, so he was essentially like a godfather to Lucy's two sons, and Lucy's Lucy's husband passed away right before the war because of a car crash, and then Lucy passed away in the early 1950s, and so and she was fairly young, and she was in her 40s at that time. They kept in contact until she passed, and then Renee was close to the sons.
And how about Charles from the factory?
So Charles, the entrance of the Delahaye company into motorsport was a big success, in part because of Lucy, and they ended up winning what was called the Million Franc Prize, which was the fastest car in France in 1937. So it helped revitalize the company. During the war, of course, the company and the factories were taken over by the Germans. Monsieur Charles sort of fought against that. They sabotaged the plant. At a certain point, there were a number of race car drivers that were actually in the resistance, working for the British SOE, actually, Special Operations Executive, which was their guerrilla groups that would be in country. And then, the Delahaye company after the war got subsumed by another company, which got subsumed by another company, and they disappeared by I believe, the late 1950s. But their cars still, their vintage cars are some of the most treasured because of their sort of Art Deco design of their bodies. And the sports car version of the Delahaye 135, some of the finest body, builders ever really built for those cars. And I wish I had a shot of them because their architecture.
When getting back to the writing of the book, did you approach this book the same way you would have done with Hunting Eichmann or The Escape Artist, as far as the research goes?
I'll just get back to the, I sort of, I don't know what number you'd want to call this book, number 8 adult book. So I have a sort of systemized way of approaching these stories now, where they generally take about 3 years. The first 2 years is largely spent on research. And so really, tracking down everything written about this period of time, tracking down the newspapers, the magazines, and then trying to find people who were involved in this story, whether, I interviewed a number of mechanics for Bugatti and some drivers from, who were older from that period of time, to collecting memoirs and unwritten stuff from family members who are still alive. So that period is pretty intense. It's kind of like detective work. I love it. And then I spent about a year sort of actually writing. And then, another year like this, chattering away. So every 4 years I get to talk.
What was the most...
Which is why I keep going on and on and on.
Well, keep coming.
I apologize.
Well, but keep going. What was the most surprising thing you found during your research?
Less than surprising. I think I'll say like one of the more fun finds that I discovered was, because as I said earlier, like Lucy Shell was a tough nut to crack, right? No memoirs, no surviving children. And I really wanted to sort of write about her in a very visceral, real way. I wanted to be in the car with her when she was, during her early days of driving, because she was known to be super sharp and a big risk taker. And I ended up finding this obscure, I was going through this French newspapers, like dozens of French newspapers. And in one of them, which was owned what it turns out to be by a friend of hers, he sent a journalist with her in 1933 to essentially be a backseat companion on her Monte Carlo rally expedition from way up almost in the Arctic all the way down to Monaco. So he was with her for over 10 days, chronicling every moment of going up there to driving back with her husband. There were crashes when the car broke down, the lack of sleep, how her smile broadened every time, things got really dangerous, to almost missing the boat to ferry them on to mainland Europe, to other people crashing, and just how she was, how she talked, how she interacted with her husband, their relationship, her sort of ability to drive on ice, everything. And so finding this obscure little article that's not referenced anywhere, and it was, I think there were 7 segments of this article, probably 10,000 words over a course of 2 weeks. And so that when I introduced Lucy and Faster, it's her racing in this race, and it's by virtue of the fact that I found this series of articles written by this. And so it's like little things like that. It's a little less surprising than it's like, oh, this little gem that's going to help readers really get a feel for who she was. And that's, that's exciting to me.
Yeah. Can you explain the difference between a rally and a race?
Yeah, I mean, I might be slightly wrong, but I venture to say, a rally is generally a multi-day, multi-course event. So the rally that Renee, or that Lucy would do, and Renee ended up doing the Monte Carlo rally too. It's, over the course of several days and several nights, there are checkpoints that you have to meet. You have to drive at you have to maintain a certain miles per hour average over the course of time. A race I consider more of a who gets there first the fastest, no matter what. Kind of thing, and the Monte Carlo rally is less that than a kind of an endurance event, and there are little, not to get into the minutiae too much, but then there are tests, stopping tests and braking tests and speed acceleration tests and figure 8 tests that they have to do, all which win points to ultimately determine who the winner is.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wish we had more time. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you. It's been fun.
I appreciate you being with us. I hope everybody reads it. I hope everybody goes out and buys the book.
No, thank you. And do we have any questions, or are we quiet on the quote? Did we answer everything, Mark?
I think we answered everything. Yes. Yeah. If you want to do a postscript, add on anything.
Yeah, no, I would just say, the stories, again, of writing about Lucy in particular, and the relationship between Renee and Lucy, which developed, there was no romance there, right? It was this incredible friendship that they had, and they kind of saved each other in a way. And it's there's a lot of racing in this book, and a lot of fun, going 120 miles an hour around a sharp turn, which is pretty fun to describe and write and hopefully read. But it's really a story about these two people and what they managed, the extraordinary thing they managed to do together. And that's what I hope readers go for looking.
Okay. I think you mentioned this at the beginning, but what are you working on now? What's next?
So I'm writing the story of Gandhi's Salt March, which in 1930 was his protest, largely for the independence of India, but it was a protest against the fact that the British taxed salt, which is something that your average Indian could collect on the seashore. And so he marched over a course of weeks, hundreds of miles, and developed this movement across India that really shook the British to their core and was the sort of first step towards Indian independence.
Is this going to entail trips to India?
It was supposed to, but sadly, India is having a tough spell with COVID. So my trips there have been put on hold. I've been there several times already.
Yeah.
But I was hoping to make one more trip down to where the march was, but I might have to wait another year. I mean, I pray everything gets better there.
Yeah, I hope. I've got another question just came in. Was there any retribution against the German drivers after losing the race?
There wasn't, at least ostensibly, and I found nothing in the files about it. They largely deflected blame towards, the cars weren't ready because it was the first race of the season, and everything else that they could to obscure the fact that that Renee and Lucy wiped the floor with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for years and years, I think Mercedes had a tough time in the United States market.
Yes, they did. Particularly, yes, and that was in fact what Rudy was assigned to do. The first cars sold, they were selling well in Germany and elsewhere, but his job was to help promote it both in the United States and Europe, but he wasn't terribly successful.
Was it an overall lack of sales in the United States, or just sales towards a Jewish population who didn't want to buy it?
I'd be venturing into territory I don't know the answer to.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you again.
Thank you.
Pleasure talking to you. Looking forward to the next book.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight.
Thank you. And thank the audience. Thank you for joining us this evening. And I hope you enjoyed the program. Be sure to visit Jewish VA, that's one word, jewishva.org/bookfest for all of our upcoming events. Next week, we will welcome author Lisa Novick Goldberg virtually to Tidewater at 12 p.m. to discuss her book, The Apple and the Shady Tree, The Mafia, My Family, and Me. Thank you and good night.